The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The conversation underway today around Canada's historic treatment of Indigenous people has many precursors. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. One of them was a protest movement known as Idle No More. Tonight, we'll look back at its early days and the context it offers us now. Idle No More began in November of 2012 in protest to the Canadian government's so-called omnibus bill C-45, which became known as the Jobs and Growth Act. 4 women in Saskatchewan concerned about the bill, eroding Indigenous treaty rights and environmental protection, put a call out on social media for a meeting in Saskatchewan titled Idle No More. In just a few weeks, it became a movement, with major demonstrations across the country and in Ottawa, outside then Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office. While the immediate aim was to stop the passage of that bill, its influence became much bigger than that, continuing to this day as a grassroots, women-led movement for Indigenous rights that spans the continent. This conversation from January 2013 took place just days before Prime Minister Stephen Harper met with Indigenous leaders.
Whatever it is, it seems to have come together quite organically, but do you think you're the head of a movement?
Oh, I'm not the head of the movement.
Not the head, at the head. I mean, you are you?
It's an organic people's movement without any bureaucracy. You don't have any elected leaders or paid politicians. And what you have is a series of organizers and spokespeople across the country. And the thing about this movement is that it respects the sovereignty of individuals and First Nations, so that it's okay for us to say different things at different times. And some of us want to do marches and rallies. Some of us just want to do round dances. Some of us don't want to be involved. And that's the beauty of this movement. And I think, the Minister Duncan also denied that this was a movement. He said this was just a little bunch of social media. But I think the international community has recognized that it's a movement. I mean, you can't deny it exists. There's activities going on every day. It's been that way for a month, and we're ramping up. We have a strategic action plan about how to expand. So if it looks like a movement and walks like a movement, it seems to be a movement to me.
What do you think sparked it?
Oh, I know the legislation sparked it. I mean,
as opposed to the hunger strike.
Oh, yes, this was it started before Chief Spence's hunger strike. And you have to keep in mind, her hunger strike she's doing that separately. We're standing in solidarity with her, but she's not part of the Idle No More movement. And similarly, the actions being taken by First Nations chiefs across the country, that's something that they had planned on doing anyway, and we're all working in tandem.
Russell, the name, we're going to get to the legislation that everybody is concerned about, but first let's do one more thing on this. The name Idle No More suggests, of course, that there was plenty to be idle about in the past, or that people were too idle in the past. You think that's true?
I think that's true for a lot of the grassroots people who haven't really been involved. But then the Indian Act system, the chief and councils are reporting to Ottawa more than to the people. So the people are often left out in the decisions. And I think that's what Idle No More reflects, is that the people are getting involved and having a say in, the politics affecting their lives, like this suite of legislation. The hashtag that I've been promoting is Idle No More, KNOW, because one of my concerns about Idle No More is that they've been focusing on C-45 and some of the bills, but my contention is there's a larger agenda at play, and that's the self-government and land claims policies on top of the legislation. And those are all based on essentially terminating Aboriginal treaty rights over time. And that's been an agenda of the federal government since the 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy. But the difference between 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy was it was a statement of principles. In 2012 and 13, we have a plan that the Harper government's implementing, and the plan is this suite of legislation. And don't forget, in September 4th of 2012, we announced 3 new policy measures. One was this results-based approach to negotiating modern treaties and self-government agreements. There's 92 tables across the country representing hundreds of bands And basically, that's a federal assessment process they announced, saying we're going to drop tables that aren't prepared to settle on final agreements under our terms. And then the second initiative was he capped and cut the funding for First Nations political advocacy organizations, provincial territorial organizations. He's capping them to $500,000 a year, which is going to cripple their ability for the chiefs to meet and analyze activities of federal and provincial governments, including policies and legislation. And he also, the third announcement he made was that they're cutting advisory services to bands and tribal councils over the next 2 years. Meanwhile, in 2011 and 12, Indian Affairs alone spent $110 million in legal costs fighting First Nations. And the federal government in total spent about $500 million in legal costs, not just dealing with First Nations issues, but Department of Fisheries and Oceans, a chunk of that goes against fighting fishing rights of Aboriginal peoples and so on and so on. Yet they're saying we shouldn't have advisory services or the ability to advocate and represent our interests. So there's a larger agenda at play here, which I call Harper's termination plan, than what the I Don't Know More movement's been talking about.
Okay, Russell, you put a lot on the table here, so let's actually, in the interest of getting everybody up to speed on the background here, talk about what these acts are that there is so much concern about. And for the record, we did invite the Minister, John Duncan, to be here today. He declined the invitation, but here's what they're up to. If we could, control room, here we go. Bill C-45, which is at the top of the list of irritants here. C-45 is the second omnibus budget bill, was introduced by the Harper government on the 18th of October 2012. The bill passed, has received royal assent on the 15th of December. It's now known as the Jobs and Growth Act 2012. And while the act changes legislation in some 60 other acts and regulations, the changes to the following acts concern Idle No More the most. The Indian Act, obviously. The Navigation Protection Act, which is the former Navigable Waters Protection Act, and the Environmental Assessment Act. Now, that's a big chunk of stuff to go through, so let's start to go through this. Pamela, get us started here. The key objections that your movement has to the changes that C-45 makes are what?
Well, just what you listed. So the unilateral amendments to the Indian Act in terms of the land surrender provisions without consulting with First Nations and accommodating and getting their consent. I mean, that's clearly the Supreme Court of Canada says you have a duty to consult and accommodate, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People says actually you have to get consent.
They say there's no surrender. They say there is no land surrender.
Okay, under the Indian Act, it's called a surrender. There's a conditional surrender and an absolute surrender. An absolute surrender is when you give it away permanently for sale, for example. A conditional surrender is also called a designation, usually done for leasing purposes.
Right, and that's all this is, right? Just leasing.
Well, I wouldn't just say that's all this is. What it's doing is changing the threshold about how you can surrender those lands for leasing purposes. You could literally have a First Nation of 10,000 people and a handful of people show up and surrender the entire reserve land to give to Enbridge, for example.
But that's their point. Their point is if there's no quorum there, that shouldn't hold back, quote unquote, progress.
Well, yeah, progress for who and in whose interest? We all know, Indian Affairs controls these referendums, and that's the problem. Not everybody gets all the information, and many traditional communities don't participate in Indian Act referendums because they very much resist that colonially imposed system. So what you could have is 5 or 6 people control the entire agenda and actually lose all of that land. And think about pipelines or mining. You could permanently destroy Indigenous communities.
That's true. Well, I don't know if that's true, but the government's position is you previously needed a majority of the majority to show up and make it happen, which meant that if you couldn't get a quorum to show up, nothing would happen at all.
No, but that actually didn't happen. If you couldn't get a quorum, they would call a second meeting. Because that was the process that Indian Affairs used. And that's there for a reason, to make sure that you're hearing the voice of the people on those kinds of land surrenders.
I was just going to say that. If they didn't show up to make the decision, it's because they didn't want that decision made.
Yes.
That's why they're not showing up. I mean, that's the same, I think, in any government. The realities are in the communities that they do not want to see their lands alienated. And if they're going to be alienated, they sure as heck want to have a say in how it's done and where it goes. They want to be part of the economics. They want to be assured that they're getting an equitable distribution of wealth from the resources that are being extracted. They want to have sustainable economies in their communities. And there's about 50 15 communities across Canada that are, quote unquote, self-governing, and they've made separate decisions for how they approach those kinds of issues. But the majority of communities across this country are, in fact, Indian Act.
Okay, but let me, this may not be an appropriate analogy, Hayden, but you help me out with this, okay, so we can understand it better. If, for example, there were going to be a referendum on whether or not to put a casino in downtown Toronto, if you're a citizen of Toronto and you don't show up to vote in the referendum, you don't get the right to complain afterwards that, well, my views weren't taken into account. You don't show up to vote, tough luck.
I don't think it's an appropriate an analogy. I think that Russell made a really interesting point about the accountability in First Nation communities, and leaders, band council leaders and councils aren't really accountable to people in the communities. They're accountable to the federal government. And I think that there aren't a lot of avenues for action, for input by First Nations peoples into the political process. That's why I think that I Don't Know More is coalescing not only around resisting changes that the federal government's making, but also coalescing around activism against band council chiefs, against the AFN, against the system that prohibits them any active participation in governance. So, City of Toronto, maybe citizens have more access and more avenues and more arenas through which to engage their leaders. First Nation communities don't have that, so it's less of an. The analogy isn't that strong. And who would advocate against community consultation? I mean, you want to have people to be able to be informed and make decisions about.
Let me get Terry on this then, because clearly the First Nations communities are portraying this as an issue of inadequate consultation. The government is putting it forward as you can't consult forever. At some point, you've got to be able to make a decision. Where do you come down on this, Terry?
It's where I come down generally on this is that there's been a lot of hysteria and misinformation about the provisions in that particular amendment to the Indian Act, which is too bad because there's actually some very, very, very serious and legitimate concerns that Aboriginal people have raised about the specifics of that amendment. The way that plays out in a lot of Aboriginal communities west of the Rockies, a third of the Indian bands in Canada are out here in British Columbia, is that a lot of Aboriginal people have only the most tenuous connections to their home communities. They're off reserves, but they're still on the banned list. And when a resource company comes along and says, well, we want to build a refinery on, your reserve number 3, and there's a big payoff to it, and everybody gets a check in the mail, but the people who live back in the community, they don't want to be waking up in the morning in the shadow of a horrible chemical refinery. So there are really, really difficult issues here that should be properly canvassed and reported and resolved. And that's my complaint about this whole thing, is that there's another one is that there is a treaty infringement, an abrogation involved in removing federal environmental protection from hundreds, thousands, I've read millions of lakes and streams and rivers across Canada. This is fiction. It's absolute fiction. It's simply not true. There are amendments to the Fisheries Act. I'm not in favor of them. I'm not arguing for them. I think they're ridiculous. There's amendments to the Navigable Waters Protection Act that reduce the slim likelihood that a federal environmental assessment review process might be kicked in the event of a bridge going across a stream that actually might have some effect on maintaining environmental integrity on the project. It's this kind of hysteria and incoherence that I think is actually not serving the Aboriginal interest whatsoever.
Russell, I want to pick up with this point with you. This is not the first time that we have seen Aboriginal communities, leaders, representatives in the news over an extended period of time because of crises. Some people are old enough to remember the white paper Pierre Trudeau brought out in 1969, which created one heck of a firestorm. There, of course, was the Oka crisis back in the 1990s, and now we have Idle No More. I'm wondering if, in your view, there is something different about this time with Idle No More.
Yes, this time we have smartphones, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have a lot of young people, people of other ages who have adapted that technology for us to be able to communicate and organize, gather and meet. And I think I Don't Know More really emerged using this technology and the social media to be able to start to get together, to do the flash mobs, to organize the demonstrations that are happening, to communicate messages. I mean, I'm on Twitter myself and Facebook at my age. I'm one of the older ones. And I'm seeing what's being communicated through the I Don't Know More movement. So to say it's not a movement, as Terry Glavin is saying, I don't agree, because, you know, I'm old enough to be involved in political movements myself from the 70s on, and with the American Indian movement and others. And I know a movement when I see it, and this is a movement. And I've been in communication with different local organizers. It's certainly grown way beyond four founders. And, you know, with all due respect to Pam, I know she's been out there in front speaking for I Don't Know No More. There's a lot more people that are active locally and regionally, and they're networking up through the social media and talking about, you know, the upcoming Harper meeting and what to do. And some are saying, you know, let's demonstrate outside. You know, we don't want anything to do with inside. Some are saying there should be a delegation inside. I mean, there is no real consensus from what I can see. But that's healthy. I mean, that's a discussion that's going on. So this I Don't Know More movement, as I see it, I do say it's a movement. It's a social and political movement where it's bringing people in who haven't really had a say or a voice before in what's been going on in the governance of our community. And don't forget, a lot of our people, you know, are in the urban areas. They're not just in the cities for various reasons. They've had to move there. But that doesn't mean they're not that's not part of their community. I don't live in my home community, but it's still my home community, and I'm still connected and go there as often as I can.
Understood.
And so, you know, I think we're all in this together, whether we're living on the reserve or off the reserve. We're still members of our communities and our nations.
In it together, Pamela, but I'm wondering how much of a generation gap you think there is in Idle No More.
Well, that's the great thing about this people's movement. There is no generation gap because the elders were calling on grassroots people and leaders to have this movement. Youth are involved, men and women. You've got people on and off reserve status and non-status, treaty and non-treaty. You've got the whole variety of everyone that is represented in our communities. And you also have this diversity of views and nations, and that's okay. Every time you try to put us all in the Indian label and we're all one people and we all have the same views, that's why we have so many problems. But when you allow for the diversity of our nations, all of our different cultures and backgrounds and views and ideas, that's great. So everything that we've talked about here today, there are people who are very upset with their chief and council, and then there's others who value their chief and council because they've chosen a traditional path or they work with their traditional leaders. And so you can't really paint all First Nation leaders with the same brush. There are some good people doing some really good work, and this movement recognizes that while also recognizing the problems that do exist in many communities. And I think that's what's healthy about this, that we're allowed to be different and have different ideas. And you know what? It may upset the media that they can't point a finger on one specific slogan, but that's okay because that's who we are as diverse nations.
Terry, can I get you to weigh in on that?
If I could just add, sorry, I Don't Know More is also attracting a lot of Canadian support who are getting involved, you know, non-Aboriginal peoples as well. And that should be noted because it's contributing to a dialogue in this country that's long overdue between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples about the relationship. And, you know, while I'm talking about this, to me, this problem goes back to the constitutional talks in the 1980s. They failed to resolve what the meaning of Section 35 in the Constitution was, the meaning of Aboriginal treaty rights. And that until we get some consensus on the meaning of Section 35 on both sides, we're not going to have reconciliation because the government's been dictating to us that Section 35 is empty of anything until we sign agreements with them. And we've been saying to them, no, Section 35 recognizes and affirms our Aboriginal treaty rights, and we have to have consensus on what that means in this country. That's the real issue to me.
I suspect you all saw Jeffrey Simpson's column in the newspaper in the Globe and Mail over the weekend, and I want to read just a snippet of it here, and then Terry, I'll get you to comment on this first, and we can finish up on this. It's called Living in a Dream Palace. And Jeffrey writes, too many communities remain within the dream palace, hungering for a return to a more separate existence, even if the lands on which they sit are, and likely always will be, of marginal economic value. At Awapiskat, Chief Spence's community is subject to severe flooding given its location on the James Bay Plain, but it refused to consider moving further upriver or near Timmins where there might be employment opportunities. To imagine that isolated communities of 1,000 or so people can be vibrant and self-sustaining, capable of discharging the panoply of responsibilities of quote-unquote sovereignty, is to live within the dream palace of memory. Let's go around on this. Terry Glavin, your comments on that.
It's very rare that I see something of a kernel in a Jeffrey Simpson column that I agree with. I do see something of a kernel in that column that I've actually heard Aboriginal people articulate time and time and time again. One of the things about this phenomenon, whether it's a movement or not, whatever. I'm hopeful that it might be. One of the things I've noticed about this phenomenon is there is a bit of that dream palace stuff that permeates most of these events, in that, you know, a lot of the oxygen for this has been provided by the sort of activist constituencies that were anti-globalization and occupist. And one thing I find a little bit disconcerting is that there's kind of an Indian in the cupboard thing going on here, that Aboriginal people are perfectly okay if they show up and they do smudge ceremonies and they're in their regalia and they chant and they drum and they talk about sacred this and sacred that. But God forbid should Aboriginal people not only put up roadblocks, but decide how to lift the roadblocks, who gets to come in, what logging companies, mining companies will be allowed to operate on the traditional territory, under what terms and conditions, who gets the jobs, how much do they pay, what happens to the product, where does it go. These are extremely difficult, all of the difficult challenges that face Aboriginal communities in the militant assertion of their rights to self-government and their rights to ownership and jurisdiction over their lands. And I agree, there's a lot of, you know, Turtle Island, Mother Earth, I've heard it before. And I mean, Russell, I hope Russell is right and I'm wrong on this. I hope that a movement might actually emerge, that some young Aboriginal people might actually assert some leadership in the vanguard of this and start asserting some discipline around some identifiable and achievable goals. But right now, yeah, I think there actually is a lot of the sort of fairyland dream palace, you know, let's dress up and bang drums. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that too. I think it's really encouraging for a lot of young Aboriginal people to see that there's actually a great deep reservoir of support and sympathy and empathy among the non-Aboriginal communities. That stuff is fine, but it's got to move on from here. Otherwise, it's just going to collapse under the weight of its many contradictions.
Let me get Cynthia's view on Jeffrey Simpson's piece, "The Dream Palace of Memory" is what he called it.
You know, Native people in Canada see themselves as different in some very fundamental ways, whether it's philosophy or spiritual practices or their belief systems in you know, when it comes to the world around them. And they've maintained that. It's 2013, and they've still maintained that. So that should tell people that it's a fundamental sense of who they are. It's not something that they're dreaming up or they're in memory of. They really do want to maintain the integrity of their cultures and their communities, their languages.
And they want to say that. It's the issue of whether or not there is too much stuck in the past and not enough recognition of today's realities.
No, we have people, you know, sitting at this table who have doctorates and who are working in universities, and we have people working in the mines that are working alongside everybody else, and we have people living in Europe, and we have people flying airplanes. I mean, the realities are that we are as diverse in our society as anybody is diverse in their societies, and I think that the problem is that there's never been any kind of real respect for the fact that we've asserted time and time again there were treaties made in this country, there was a relationship that was formed and was never really upheld. The lands that we sit on and continue to live on need to be in our hands and protected. There's no respect for that. Our women are treated marginally. There's rape going on in Thunder Bay right now because of, you know, in the name of. There's a lot of things that are going on that want to remove people from their lands and from their resources. As far as I'm concerned, it's a four-letter word that keeps us divided, and it's land. Hayden, your view?
I think that the Simpson column's unfortunate on the one hand, you know. I mean, I guess for some people, Native people asserting their rights is scary, maybe a nightmare as opposed to a dream for people like Simpson. But on the other hand, there's some merit to what he has to say in the sense that we haven't fully defined what Indigenous nationhood means. I think if anything important comes out of I Don't Know More, it's that nations start coming together and start articulating their vision of national governments and national movements and negotiating with Canada based on a nation-to-nation basis. I mean, maybe Simpson is right that work hasn't been done yet, but it is being done. We're working on it, and if anything comes out of I Don't Know More, I hope it's that.
I think for what it's worth, Jeffrey Simpson would be the last guy to say that there isn't a long, proud, 2 minutes to go, long and proud tradition of many Aboriginal communities in this country that make us part of what we are all here. But I think he's saying that there's too much stuck in the past in completely unsustainable communities. And Pamela, he thinks people have got to stop dreaming, living in this dream palace of memory. Does he have a point?
No, he doesn't have a point. Memory and history and culture and tradition is what makes all of our societies. I mean, you wouldn't have a constitution. I mean, that's based on all of your many centuries of laws and values and principles, and the same for us. Why should Canadians be able to live the good life, but not First Nations the way we want to live the good life? And it's really a myth to think that someone's location prohibits them from living the good life the way they want to. We lived here since time immemorial, and we lived here just fine. There's a mine outside of Attawapiskat. It's not that there's no resources in these northern communities. And now that you can see, some of the richest resources in this country are in the north. So it's not that there's no resources or there's no employment. It's that First Nations don't have access to their own lands and resources. That's what the real issue is.
And that's going to be the last word today. I want to thank everybody for coming in and helping us with this most important conversation tonight. Out in Victoria, British Columbia, via Skype, Terry Glavin, the columnist with the Ottawa Citizen. Terry, thanks for being there out west for us today. In Temiskaming, Quebec, via Skype, Russell Diabo, editor of the First Nations Strategic Bulletin. Russell, thank you very much as well for being there just east of us. And here in studio, Pamela Palmater, Idle No More organizer, chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. Hayden King, Associate Professor of Politics, Ryerson University. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, Nexen Chair in Indigenous Leadership at the Banff Centre.
And that's it for tonight's agenda in the summer. The drowned body of a small boy on a beach in Turkey moved the world and Canada to respond to the plight of Syrians fleeing war. Tomorrow, we look back at that. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. And we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.